Chapter 2. Life During the War. The people of the city of Manila were in panic. Bombs were exploding, buildings were burning, and the sounds of sirens were everywhere. The whole population must have been on the move, as all modes of transportation were packed with people. I still do not know how my grandfather, the Reverend Arcadio Reyes, managed to get to the city from our town of Novaliches, a distance of about 30 miles, in order to help his daughter and grandson evacuate. We were walking and running and trying to get a ride to the countryside. With one suitcase in hand and me perched on his shoulders, my grandfather just kept on walking with my mom close behind, carrying some bags of whatever she could take with her. We managed to get to the city known as Blumentritt. This is where the buses bound for our town of Novaliches begin their route. Looking back and placing myself in my grandfather's shoes, I cannot imagine what a father would do when he heard that the city where his only daughter and grandson was living was being bombed, and the whole city was burning. He took the first bus he could to go to Manila and just ran towards Ermita. My grandfather and mother walked from Ermita to Blumentritt, a distance of about 10 miles. No bus would stop for anyone except when specifically given orders by someone in a position to do so. That was my Uncle Canuto. He was a Halili bus inspector and well-liked by his drivers. He gave specific instructions to any drivers who happened to see his father and sister to pick them up. Before long, a bus full of people stopped for us. We arrived in Novaliches, where we owned a big house just off the main road. It was a 2-story home with the main floor portion converted into a sari-sari store. Sari-sari means variety, a small convenience store. There was a Japanese fellow married to a Filipina that used to deliver goods to my mom's store. He lived in the area and was known by the community. He in turn knew about everyone else, and this was the problem. He knew that my dad was a member of the U.S. Navy. As soon as the Japanese forces landed, Appa, as he was popularly known, also donned his Japanese Army uniform. He was with the intelligence unit of the Japanese Imperial Army. The first group of Japanese soldiers to land was the Korean detachment. They were the meanest bunch of soldiers in the world, and they proved it. This was the group that killed babies by tossing them in the air and spearing them with their bayonets. They raped women as they made their way around the countryside. Thanks to Appa, our family name, Ramil was instantly on their wanted list because we were related to a member of the United States military. Many of our neighbors and townmates were leaving our town, and so our family also began making preparations. My mom was pregnant, so we had to wait until she gave birth to my sister, Norma, who was named after a movie actress, Norma Blancaflor. She was born on July 10, 1942. Soon my grandfather decided that we all join his brother, Faustino, who recently returned from Hawaii and was able to buy a farm in the outskirts of Novaliches, known as Pasong Putik. It was my father who ran into him in Honolulu just before the war and suggested that he return to the Philippines. He had a house big enough for 2 families and about an acre of land to plant vegetables. There was also a river and a creek nearby loaded with fish, shrimp, and freshwater clams. My cousins and I were oblivious of the world's situation. We were happy doing what was expected from us. The 2 families were my Uncle Tayong and his family, my mother and my grandmother and grandfather, and our great-uncle Lolo, Grandpa Tino. There were 4 of us kids, my 2 cousins Eddie and Ernesto, my sister Norma, and me. Eddie, who was a few months older than me, was almost 5 years old. He was my partner in doing our assigned chores. We always did things together as we were the oldest of the kids. Our duties were to fetch water from a well, which was about 300 yards from our house. It was located between the river and the creek. We also had to fish, hunt, and gather fruits and firewood. We learned how to catch shrimps by making a hideout for them. We assembled and bundled twigs and tied them together. Then we lowered the trap in the deep part of the creek and left it there overnight. In the morning, we would take a net and place it under the twigs. Shrimps would be jumping as we raised the net to the surface. We would gather them and take them home to be cooked by my aunt or my mother. Our grandfather also taught us how to build fish traps. We would dig out a small portion of the riverbank, make a sort of a tunnel and build a fence to enclose the hollowed portion of the river bank. The fence was made of bamboos. The two middle pieces rest on a stick, which acted as the trigger. These two pieces of bamboo fence were heavier than the rest, as it is packed with mud on top. When a fish enters the fenced-in area, it would touch the stick and will cause the weighted pieces to drop down. We caught a lot of fish this way. We also raised a lot of plants like yams, corn, rice, and several varieties of vegetables. I can say one thing: although many suffered hungers, our family was lucky enough to always have food for our existence. Our grandfather also taught us how to build animal traps. We caught quails, monitor lizards, and even a young wild pig. We also became very good with our slingshots. I remember hitting a dove once while it was flying. We would also gather all kinds of fruits, as the tropical climate was so conducive to local fruit trees, and the abundance of papayas, star apples, jackfruits, santol, and the ever-available guavas made our life bearable. My favorite was gathering jicamas or sincamas in Tagalog. It grows all over, and it was very easy to find. We would dig it from the ground using a pointed stick. This was our snack, and it was so good. I particularly liked the small ones because they were sweeter and much juicier than the big ones. There were a lot of yucca roots, or what we call kamoteng kahoy. This was my second favorite. We would just pull the whole plant off the ground and we would place it on the bonfire. When the fire is out, our feast begins. Oh, and about Appa, the Japanese spy? We found out later on that a group of Filipino guerrillas were able to get hold of him after he donned his uniform and killed him. I believe that he did not have enough time to give his report to his superiors. Our first order of business was to build an air raid shelter. We found the ideal location. Not far from our house were 3 mature santol trees. The trunks were about 3 feet in diameter, a local fruit that is sweet and sour and grows wild in our area, growing in a cluster but far enough from each other that we were able to dig out an air raid shelter between the 3 trees. Our 2 grandfathers and Uncle Tayong took turns digging using a pick and a shovel. It took them almost a week to finally finish the digging, and when it was finished, it measured 6 feet by 8 feet and about 8 feet deep. We covered it over with bamboos, palm leaves, and dirt. It had a built-in steps so we can actually walk down into it. There was enough space for all of us, especially if we huddled. In one corner, we stacked emergency supply of water in a big jug. We actually hid in the shelter whenever we hear unknown airplanes flying in the area. It also served as a very good hiding place when us kids played hide and seek. On one occasion, a platoon of Japanese soldiers got lost and ended up at our place. They decided to take a break and wanted to use our fire pit to cook their rice. Of course, they did not have to ask for our permission. The problem was, at about that time, a U.S. spotter plane was in the area, and my grandfather was afraid that the pilot might just start shooting at the Japanese soldiers. So my grandfather literally pulled them and suggested they hide under the trees. He was ignored, and they continued just sitting around in the open enjoying their lunch. It was a good thing that the spotter plane did not do anything else and continued its flight. This was a sign that big things were about to happen. Little did we know that General MacArthur was only a few days away from his promise to return. We could sense that even the Japanese soldiers knew their days were getting short. They were no longer as mean as they used to be. At this time, we made a plan to go to town to check out our house, as we heard that it was occupied by a Japanese detachment and made into their headquarters. Because the civilians were no longer in great danger, my mom, Auntie Akang, Eddie, and I went down to the town. We arrived at our house and saw the damage done by the soldiers that occupied it. It is now abandoned and run down. It was vandalized after the soldiers left. We saw some of what was left of our furniture after using it as firewood. Even parts of our house were burned. Garbage was strewn all around, and the whole place was in disarray. We attempted to clean it as best we could, and as we were rummaging through the kitchen cabinets, my aunt found some flour, which we managed to take back with us. When we arrived at the farm, my aunt did not waste any time. She started preparing dough from the flour she found and made some butsi. This is like fritters made from flour dough and filled with sweetened yams and then deep fried. It is a very tasty and sought-after delicacy. My cousin Eddie and I were down at the river checking on our traps, so we were not around when the first batch of bootsy were passed out to everyone. Our great-uncle Faustino ate the most, and all of a sudden his mouth began to froth and he went into convulsions. The others who had eaten the fritters also began experiencing food poisoning. This was the time everyone realized that the flour we found was not really flour but rat poison. Those who ate the bootsy were given chunks of cubed brown cane sugar by my grandmother. This was a cure she learned early on. This is probably what saved us. Unfortunately, our granduncle Faustino was not able to recuperate. He died shortly, probably within 2 weeks. He was not able to see the Americans return. It just dawned on me that, was my mother, Fausta, named after our great-uncle? I should have known. After several weeks and after our great-uncle's funeral, my mom decided to return to our house. This we did. It took us several days to make our house livable again. Lucky for us, our artesian well was still working. We had clean water and the pump was still functional. The storage tank on top of the roof was still in good condition. Our life was slowly turning normal. My uncle and his family lived across the street from us, and they too were settled in. My grandfather and grandmother lived with us, as our mother is their Ini, or only daughter. One night, there was a big commotion, and we heard gunshots. We were told to leave the area as the Americans had landed, and a big fight with the Japanese soldiers would take place. We were to go to the next town. Everyone was on the move. Most of our relatives managed to stay together as we made our way to the next town. The road was packed with people. There was no way you could move about. You occupied your space and you just moved forward in unison. We traveled all night, and at daybreak we arrived at the next town called Bagbag. Here we settled and rested our weary bodies just sitting by the side of the road. There were rice fields all around, and we just laid there resting. We were told later on that behind us were the Japanese soldiers. They cleverly used us as their shield in the cover of the night. Once daylight came, they ran back into the woods. The Americans had not landed, so it was a false alarm. We slowly returned to our houses, a distance of about 10 miles. Not long afterwards, we did see some American planes. They were firing at the fleeing Japanese soldiers.